Over 50 years have passed since the heady days of the Yorkville music scene, but elements of the culture remain. On May 4th, 2023, a world premiere of the documentary Essential Noise by Paul Koidis took place in Toronto's Annex area at Club Transac. Yorkville helped spawn a revolution in music that would later come to full fruition in the explosion of folk and psychedelic rock in California. Artists like Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, Buffy St. Marie, Leonard Cohen, and Gordon Lightfoot were among the Canadian artists who were a vital part of this music renaissance that took place in the many coffee houses and clubs of Yorkville. Many who were present have fond memories of those days, and even younger viewers came eager to learn more about the history. They stayed around to listen to a Q&A with musicians that played at the actual clubs, who shared stories of an amazing moment in time. Unfortunately, there is little archival film footage, and many of the musicians have left us. However, director Paul Koidis' documentary style effectively utilizes oral history and is a gift that helps us imagine the magic that took place.
It would take this long before someone would finally say, hey, this was a major cultural event with consequences that went far beyond just Yorkville neighborhood. And so I'm glad that it's finally somebody's going to put this right, as it were.
And turned into a major artistic center, and it still is today. So I think understanding Yorkville helps to understand how today we have people coming from Toronto who are dominating the pop charts, dominating the hip hop charts, and who are dominating in film, in television, in literature. And I think that we can trace a lot of the beginnings right to that era.
This was the place to be soon, and then by 1967, it was all the coffee houses, all the great rock bands, the roots of Toronto rock and roll, but the new rock and roll, the hair come down, the things that the Beatles brought us, and the hippie thing that was about to come. I moved here in 1970, and I can give you a little tour. I'm not a historian exactly. Let's talk about the history of the hallowed ground on which we stand.
Thanks very much. That was our movie. For sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's awesome. I really appreciate it. That's fantastic.
Big vessel with me sometimes. I just sit there.
Get the film and maybe even give you a chance to ask some questions. So, if it's not too much of an ask, can Dan Hill, David Depoe, and Robbie Lane come join me on stage and let's give them some encouragement, please. Dan's going to make his way up. You just make yourself at home. I'm sure you're comfortable. Well, thank you so much. There's a lot that we didn't include in the 1 hour. I had about, I think, 15 hours of just pure interview. And getting to know these folks over the past year or so has been really just life-changing for me. I mean, Bob Ezra talked about how watching Gordon Lightfoot at the Riverboat was life-altering for him. Meeting all of these folks who were a part of that amazing scene was really life-altering for me.
Shows why it was so important. And that was really that is now sort of in history, that will go down as in a 1 hour capsule. He figured out exactly what the music was all about and why it was the way it was. And Paul mentioned to me moments ago that a couple of young people came up to him and said, I had no idea that that's what happened in those days, and I wish I'd been a part of it. And I think we were lucky to be a part of it. Don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think it was captured a lot by Jeannie Becker and by Clayton Ruby especially, you know. I mean, I never knew Jeannie, but Clayton and I were lifelong friends until he passed away, and he got the meaning of the movement, the counterculture. He also talked about, you know, how we were getting harassed by the police and all that kind of stuff.
Well, that still happens to you all the time.
Anyway, yeah. So, but the idea that it was an alternative place for where people were free, where it you didn't care if you were gay or anything, if you were a decent human being, you were welcome.
You know, David, your image, you know, as a part of, you know, even just those iconic pictures of you being in the middle of those, you know, the social movement, the protest, was such a, again, iconic part of that whole view. You said something that really kind of set the tone for me, that during all that time, you know, music was your oxygen, and that there was this connection between the social movement and the musical movement that gave meaning to each other. And, you know, I mean, I want to talk to our artists here as well afterwards, but what does that mean? I mean, Dan, when you hear something like that, is that true? And what does that mean to you about how music was so important to the movement and vice versa?
Well, it was the air that we breathed, to kind of paraphrase what you just said so articulately. The idea of having a life without music, a world without music, was absolutely impossible to conceive. And first of all, we all know now that music is such a huge part of how we stay well and balanced. But then on top of that, if you're fortunate enough to play music, you know, that is in itself, it's no coincidence that Leonard Cohen kept performing. His last show was 79 in Australia, and he did 27 songs. The average set list is half that. No coincidence I saw Gordon Lightfoot just 2 Decembers ago at Massey Hall, where he stood and played for 75 minutes straight. Why is it that these people continue to perform? Neil Young, for example, Randy Bachman, you know, because that's who they are. You know, that's what defines them. So I would say for all of this, for the most part, music is our oxygen. The difference back in Yorkville in the 60s was an important thing that most of us may not remember, because a lot of you weren't around back then, is that Canada had a real inferiority complex about itself, also perpetuated by the media. You know, the media basically felt that anything Canadians were doing, whether you were an author, a painter, or a singer-songwriter, was inferior to what was ever going on in the States. You know, so even more important that Yorkville was such a mecca, because the music was absolutely exploding everywhere you went. And there were all these different places that you could perform. You didn't have to be on the level of Gordon Lightfoot. And, you know, certainly I wasn't at Gordon Lightfoot's level. Well, not that I ever am, but certainly at 15 or 16, I still hadn't come into my peak powers as a songwriter or a singer. But still, I could play all over the place. And back then, Toronto was a very inexpensive place to live, unlike now, too. So, you know, I could make a living as a 17-year-old high school dropout just playing all these little bars and coffee houses. And the community was very, very supportive. You know, no one knew who I was. I would be going to the Riverboat catching Harry Chapin, Jackson Brown, even Cat Stevens and Bob Dylan would drop by. You know, Simon and Garfunkel.
Tom Rush, Muddy Waters. There was no hierarchy. It was like we were all part of a community. Like I met Buffy St. Marie the night she first sang Universal Soldier at the Purple Onion. And we talked afterwards. I told her I thought it was a great song, and she said, "Oh, thank you." And we sat at the table and drank another coffee and became friends. And when we asked her, the Diggers, to sing at a love-in on long weekend, May 22, 1967, in Queen's Park. She said, of course. And we asked Leonard Cohen, he said, of course. And it was just like that, you know, and that 5,000 people showed up, and we got a cheap sound system from Long Quaid, which was on Yonge Street at the time, and 5,000 people showed up. And the only damage that was done was all the tulips in Queen's Park, you know, in Queen's Park, got picked because we were flower children.
Robbie, you've had a unique relationship with both Roddy Hawkins and Gordon Lightfoot. Both having left us this last year. I mean, when you think about those days, I mean, what can you describe kind of what you were feeling back then, and maybe how that kind of connects, maybe some of your connections with those two guys?
Well, with Hawkins, he was kind of like our taskmaster. He demanded everything to be just exactly the way he wanted it to be. And he would leave us, we were playing at the Cockdoor Tavern 6 nights a week and a Saturday afternoon matinee. Good thing I drank back then. But we would rehearse Monday through Thursday from 1:30 in the morning until 5 in the morning. He'd go home, but we would rehearse, and of course we were supposed to be rehearsing his songs, but we rehearse our own as well. With Lightfoot, it was a different kind of a situation with myself and him. I met him at the Steele's Tavern, little place, 2nd floor, just up the street from where we were playing, and it was mainly university kids and from Ryerson, and we would run up on our breaks to hear this guy sitting on a stool with his acoustic guitar, a beer beside him, and a burning cigarette in the ashtray, and he would just tell his stories through his songs. And fast forward 35 years, he came in to see my band playing on a Sunday afternoon, and he called me. He said, "I'm going to come out and see you this afternoon. Where are you playing?" And I told him. He said, "Okay, and I'll be there." And I said, "Do you want me to do anything, like bring in the back door?" Or, "No, I'll just come in the front." That's the way he was. He never really thought of himself as this major star in the music business, which he was. And the funny thing was that after the first set, I took him in the back hall and he wanted to talk a little. He said, "I have 3 horns in my band." And he said, "I've never really worked with a horn section before. Maybe we can work something out so that I could get up and do a couple of songs with you next time I'm around." And I said, "Well, I don't know, Gordon. Normally we get professional people up on this stage." But he and I had that kind of friendship where we could bite on each other and we still loved one another. And so this week has been, for a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, a difficult week for me, because both the Hawk and Gordon in the same year, and that's a lot in my life.
And I should mention that since we started making the film, I think at least 5 people who we've interviewed have passed on, which is why I thought it was so urgent to make the film, including myself, because I knew that I should get this documented and get these guys. We actually have a half-hour segment of Gordon talking about Yorkville that we just couldn't wrangle from the other producers for this, but it was so important to capture that.
Yeah.
And I'm really grateful that all 3 of you were a part of it. What do you think made it so magical?
I have to congratulate you for capturing those
Yes.
people. And cheap rent. I had a 1-bedroom apartment at the back of the house at 41 Hazelton Avenue for $40 a month.
Wow.
And so it was a nice place. It even had a working fireplace.
And I think, to answer your question, just from my point of view, about what was it about Yorkville, the magic, I think it was that my generation came from a background of a religious background. Our families, wanted us to go to church, and our schools didn't want us to listen to rock and roll. And so all of that was going on in the suburbs where I lived. But when you came downtown to Yorkville, I think as Jeannie Becker put it, it was freedom. You could be who you were, you could like what you liked, you could do what you wanted to do, and on top of all that, you'd hear great music from people like Dan Hill. And Dan Hill, to me, is one of those artists that we all know who he is, but I don't think Dan Hill has ever been given the kind of support that he should have, especially as a writer, but as a singer-songwriter. He's just one of the best, and he's a national treasure.
Absolutely, yeah. I saw Dan play a couple of weeks ago at a theater, and I just gotta say, just your voice and your playing guitar filled the entire theater. Like you filled it the way an orchestra would, and the kind of power that comes through with that. So I agree with you, Robbie. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's embarrass him some more, but it's
Yeah, let's do that.
But the other thing I just need to emphasize in terms of the incredibly fertile music thing that was going on then. Okay, so Gordon Lightfoot was the joiner, He was the guy where you met everybody, and also Ronnie Hopkins, who I was also really close to. But the interesting thing about Gordon is he had this spectacular Rosedale mansion. And people like myself or Bob Dylan or the band, we'd play the Riverboat, then we'd go back to his place. And we would party all night. And some of the partying I'm not going to discuss, but a lot of the partying was just all of us taking turns singing songs to each other. And you can imagine me as a 21-year-old, I was seeing things I never believed to be possible on the one hand, but Gordon was always sort of, all this stuff was possible, but he never really went that way. People like us, we always had to save our voices, so we couldn't do some of the stuff, say, that the A&R guys or the music attorneys. But at these parties, there were people that owned the radio stations, owned the hockey teams, owned the magazines. It was like literally the power brokers of Canada, and it was only happening because of Lightfoot. But for me, of course, the most important thing is all these musicians that would go back to his place. And again, as I sort of said in your wonderful film, it was all about the ability to play an instrument. It was all distilled down to piano and voice or guitar and voice. You can imagine what it would be like as a 21-year-old, high school dropout, to be hanging out in Gordon's place. And also he was astonishingly generous. One last thing I'm going to say about Gordon Lightfoot that I don't think anybody really knows. I'm very good friends with the late Michael Master, who wrote some of the biggest iconic R&B hits of the 80s. So Michael produced and wrote The Greatest Love of All for Whitney Houston. Now, if you listen to the bridge of the Greatest Love of All, it goes, I've decided long ago never to live in anyone's... Okay, now check out Gordon Lightfoot's, if you can read my mind. I don't know where the feeling's gone. I got this... it was a total, absolute, note for note, chord for chord steal. Okay, so Gordon, gets in touch with Michael Master. I mean, songs like that make, easily $25-30 million over the course of, say, 2 decades. And Michael said, Dan, can you help me here? I said, I'm not getting in the middle of a lawsuit between you and Gordon Lightfoot. I'm not going to do that. Anyway, this continued to happen. Most of the time when this happens to big writers, they settle, because it's not just a lot of money, it's very, very embarrassing. It's a real hit to your reputation. Okay, so this is what actually transpired. Gordon said to Michael, all I want is for you to write a letter acknowledging that I wrote it first. Now, what an incredible thing to do. Now, that's Gordon in a nice class, elegance. He didn't want the money. And he never ever told anybody in the media about this. He just wanted that man-to-man letter of acknowledgement. And I think that in and of itself speaks volumes about Gordon Lightfoot on so many different levels.
Absolutely. I should note that I think I heard Robbie said that we're all actually invited back to his place tonight for a party. So if you want to experience
Yeah, I just moved.
we have to make some room for some music. I've I've arranged for some great stuff. And we talked in the film about this connection to Los Angeles, and I found this new singer who has some roots in Los Angeles between here and Toronto. So I want to make some time for her. But as we wrap up, last thoughts. I mean, big ideas or anything that you think you want to get on the record about Yorkville or that time, or what do you have left to say?
I just think you've done a great job.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I
don't think we need to say anything more. You said it all.
Finally, it's being honored, and what was said during there should be a plaque in front of every single damn music place in the village, and the memories should be honored, and people in this city should know. And you've made a big step toward that, and it's really important.
Well, thank you very much. Hey, I should say this film is going to be traveling to at least 15 cities across Canada this summer, and we got invited to Bulgaria, Costa Rica, Mexico, and I'm pretty sure we'll hit New York and Los Angeles. So we'll do our best in our own small way to get the story out there. But thank you, David. I appreciate you saying that.
All of you, congratulations. You're a historian. And what's more important than history?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you very much. Well, why don't we have a round of applause for this amazing panel? These guys are history. They made so much history in Toronto. And thank you very much. We're just going to get the band ready. If you can talk to these guys or buy them a beer out there, I suppose, and chat more. But a couple minutes and we'll get started on some music. Thank you so much.